I want to say thank you to Alan and Janet for helping host, and of course the New West Public Library. I want to say thank you to all my peers sharing the podium this afternoon, and of course all the audience here. So Remembrance Day is a very special day for me and my family. My grandfather on my father's side, he served in the Korean War with the Royal Canadian Regiment in the Airborne Brigade, and then later with the Canadian Airborne Regiment, which was created in the 1960s. My parents, they met in basic training in the Navy in Cornwallis. My father transitioned from the Navy after 5 years to the regular Canadian Forces, and it wasn't too long before he joined a regiment called the Special Operations Service, or SOS, at a CFB Petawawa. Now, the SOS worked in conjunction with the Canadian Airborne Regiment on special operations, but they had a very unique task. They would go and do, small groups of them would go do risk assessments before regular troops or peacekeepers would go to different areas around the world to ensure that the risk was manageable enough for the regular peacekeepers to partake in operations. So this had my dad in all sorts of hairy situations, and he told me many, many stories, as well as his friends, both in the Airborne Regiment and the SOS. And there were many nights where I was up in my bunk bed as a young boy, listening to them drink beer and chain smoke cigarettes in the house. Yes, they smoked cigarettes in the house back then. And so I was quite inspired. I would be laying there kind of in a half-asleep state, and I would hear these stories that these men who were real-life G.I. Joes, real-life heroes to me, would share. My dad spent 23 years in the Canadian Forces. We moved from CFB Petawawa to CFB Chilliwack eventually. But the story I'm going to share tonight is from my award-winning, critically acclaimed story collection, The Stories That Make Us. And it's titled The Test. And the setting is the late 1980s in CFB Petawawa, which is near Ottawa on the Quebec border. And the theme is boyhood coming of age through a rite of passage gone awry. So here it is, The Test. Hope you enjoy. I was chewing oatmeal as I watched the great white shark torpedoed by the cameraman in the shark cage. When the phone in the hallway rang, it startled me, only because of how much louder it sounded with my sister and mother still in bed. I'd been expecting the call, so I got off the couch and rushed into the hallway to answer the phone, impressed by my own speed. It was silent. Then a boy's voice gave a simple order: be at Suicide Island in 30 minutes. A click and a dial tone followed, and I hung up. As I tiptoed to my bedroom, I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. After all, I'd been waiting my entire life for this chance to prove I was a man. 11 long years. After I changed from my Spider-Man pajamas into shorts and a t-shirt, I did a little recon upstairs. My mother slept hugging her pillow, which made up for my father, who was away on tour with his regiment in Somalia. Next, I checked on my sister. She was asleep too, surrounded by stuffed unicorns. The usual for a Saturday morning in the Granger household. If my father was home, we would have been getting ready to head out and fish the river for bass or walleye or big old channel cats. Or maybe we'd be driving into Pembroke to shop at the Army surplus, pick up some cool Army shirts with military insignias and sayings like "death from above" or "kicking butt and taking names." Over the previous few years, my father had been away on back-to-back tours in places like Cyprus, Bosnia, and Somalia, as had my friends' fathers. Morale was on the decline, my father said the last time he was home. Men were starting to get burnt out. It seemed the older boys on the base had stepped in to fill our father's boots, toughening us younger boys up with arm bars and chokeholds and dares that made men out of boys. I padded barefoot downstairs to the back entrance where I tugged on my raggedy pair of Converse that I used as river shoes, then slipped out the screen door to a clear July sky and glowing sunrise. I dashed across the dewy field beside the PMQ, startling a flock of sparrows. I gave chase. By the time I entered the woods, my feet were damp. There was a chorus of birds and insects, and a smell of pine and raw earth hung in the air. Smells I'd known since I first ran those woods, soldiering with my buddies, barefoot sometimes, toy gun with me all the time. Remembering what the older boys had said about conserving my energy for today's test, I slowed to a march on the shady path leading to Suicide Island. I pictured myself walking home in a few hours, a man's victory walk, shoulders back, proud, steady, and heroic, like my father whenever he returned home from tour. 20 minutes later, I could hear the roar and crash of the Petawawa River in the distance, and my heart began to race and hands tremble. At that moment, there was the first hint of doubt. I thought of the tales of drunken soldiers who'd stumbled along the same path and leapt into the river and drowned, and of the teenagers from Pembroke goofing around, whose car accidentally rolled into the Mackey's Rapids and sunk with them inside. Rumor was the undercurrents had washed them downriver close to Suicide Island, and both wreck and bodies were still at the bottom. But mostly, I thought of Donnie Chensky. He was a 10-year-old from the base's south side who'd drowned 2 years before while trying to pass the test. No one knew he'd drowned for 3 days, because the other boys who'd been involved had been too frightened to come forward. It was only after one boy's little sister told her mother what had happened that the military police were notified and the search began. Donnie's body was never recovered. I recalled overhearing my mother's words to my father after the search had been called off. That poor family must be devastated knowing that the river just swallowed them up like that. When I arrived at the top of the 30-foot bank, the launching area overlooking Suicide Island, I gazed down at the swift and roiling Petawawa River. It was darker than the waters of Otter Lake, where my grandparents lived in Muskoka. Images of bloated bodies with empty eye sockets and skeletons tangled in weeds bobbed up from somewhere deep in my mind, like deadheads in the river. I took a breath, opening and clenching my hands, trying to calm the tremble that was only getting worse. The island was off to the left a ways, allowing challengers some leeway as the strength of the current would sweep even the strongest swimmer downriver. It was so small that I thought it would be tough to hit with a stone. It was so small I'd spent so many nights laying in bed while staring at my G.I. Joe figures, wondering how a little hump in the river could mean so much to so many, but always falling asleep before I'd found an answer. Right in the middle of the island, next to a barren and stunted tree, sat a large pile of rocks, which I knew carried great meaning. It was the suicide pile. And next to it, a painted turtle basked in the sun leisurely. I smacked my gums, worried about the bitter taste I'd been warned of for years. All the older boys I looked up to said it might start to creep in during times like this. The taste known by deserters and chicken shits. The taste of cowardice. There were footsteps behind me and I turned quickly. My buddy Petey was walking toward me on the path, and when he waved and smiled, my tremble began to calm. Petey had that way about him, whether we were about to charge the Frenchies' fort or chat up Sarah and Rebecca at the roller rink or outside the movie theater after a matinee. We'd been buddies since before I could remember. I knew this because his mother had photos that I couldn't remember being taken. "Knew you'd show, buddy," said Petey. We high-fived like we always did when we first met and before we separated. "It doesn't look so bad," I said, nodding at the island. Petey stepped to the edge of the bank and kicked the earth and caused a small avalanche, sending up a large dust cloud into the wind. "Nah, if Greg and Steve made it, we got this all day," said Petey. "We're not going down with Donnie Chensky, that's for sure." A bird chirruped loudly from the treetops and flew out over the river in big loops. A branch cracked and ferns rustled. Petey and I locked eyes for a second, Then Chet burst from the woods, followed by the towering figure of Miles. Their faces were smeared with green camo stick, and they were dressed head to toe in green fatigues. They were both 13 years old. Older boys needed to be present to witness younger boys challenge the test. And then word spread of the results. I figured Chet and Miles had been spying on us in hopes we would take off so Chet could brand us as chicken shits. Chet was known as Chet the Tyrant, after all. As they marched toward us, Chet yanked off his green cap, exposing a light regrowth of red hair and his birthmark, which was shaped like a large kidney bean and took up half his forehead. "I was sure you twerps were going to be chicken shits," he said, flapping his arms. "Bark, bark, 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 bark." Miles started to laugh. "I told you they'd be here," said Miles. I smiled. Miles winked. Although the two of us had never played marbles or soldiered together, we lived in the same PMQ block and saw each other daily. Our fathers talked often, swapping fishing holes or borrowing tools, stuff like that. And last summer, he and my 14-year-old cousin Kylie, who visited every summer, hung around more than my father and mother had liked. "What's wrong with you, Dylan? You're pale and shaking." Chet waved a hand at me. "Ah, he's chicken shit, aren't you?" He nodded, as if he had me all figured out. He wiggled his pinky finger in the air, wiggled it like a little worm. "Don't worry, nothing's gonna bite it off. It's just a little wriggler on you anyway. A perch wouldn't even look twice." Him and Miles burst out into laughter, bouncing and shoving each other at the joke. They pounded each other's fists, like everyone did after they scored a goal or watched a hero in the latest action flick wipe out a gang of scumbags. I felt my guts squirming. I didn't like this feeling. Was I a chicken shit? Was I fooling myself, thinking I could make the swim to Suicide Island, there and back? "Least he hasn't whizzed himself," said Petey, looking at Chet. Chet's lips tightened, his kidney bean darkening. He balled his fists, eyeballing Petey. Everyone at school had heard the rumor. Chet supposedly whizzed himself right before the test a few years back, something he denied vehemently. "All right, smartass," barked Chet, puffing out his chest. "Our fathers need to pass a test to join the airborne, so we need to pass this test." He jabbed his finger toward the island. "You need to get down the bank, swim across to Suicide Island. You need to pick up a rock, put it on the suicide pile, then swim back and climb the bank. And if you screw up," he grinned wickedly, "well, you know what happens." I knew, as did every other base brat in Petawawa, on both the north and south side. If we failed to cross and put our stones on the suicide pile, we would be branded as chicken shits. We would never get to join the airborne, and we would be trampled into the mud for the rest of our lives. And then there was the girls. They would simply pass us by at the roller rink, ignore us at the matinees. We would probably end up as cooks, peeling spuds or scrubbing pots and pans, far from the foreign lands and adventures our fathers talked of often. All of our hopes for the future crushed like June bugs on a windshield. Or even worse, we might end up down at the bottom of the river with Donnie Chensky. Petey huffed as if it was no big deal and patted my shoulder. "We know, we'll make it, right, Dill?" Yeah, we're gonna make it," I said, "no problem," my voice cracking. I swallowed harder than I would have liked to and wiped sweat from my brow, wondering if the other boys could hear my pounding heart. I'd make it. It wasn't impossible, other boys had. I'd swam farther at different spots along the river, other spots where the current was just as swift and strong, but never this length with such a current. Petey pulled off his Incredible Hulk shirt and kicked off his shoes, raring to go. I did the same. I felt as if I was facing a firing squad, tense and ready for a round between my eyes. I squinted at the heat waves dancing above the island shores, the sun tingling my bare skin. The painted turtle beside the suicide pile boogied into the river and disappeared. I couldn't recall ever seeing a turtle move so quickly. It was as if he sensed what was about to happen and didn't want any part of the action. I wasn't sure how long we stayed like that before Petey said, "Don't stop for anything, Dill. You hit the water and you go." I managed only a grunt. Miles said, "You can do it," and gave us a thumbs up. Chet, meanwhile, had picked up a gnarly stick and was wielding it like a club as if ready to chase us off the edge. "All right, go, 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 go," he screamed, his kidney being darkening even more. Petey glanced at me. We both nodded, and then we stepped to the edge of the bank and jumped and hit the dirt and began to slide down. I shut my eyes and mouth as dust enveloped us. I heard Miles holler, "Don't let your legs get caught in the undertow," before we splashed into the river. The current pulled, battered, and whirled me. I fought to the surface and took a deep breath. Cheers and claps erupted from behind us. When I spotted him, Petey was already swimming towards the island. The current was sweeping us downriver. I breaststroked after him, thinking this was it, pass or fail. With every stroke and kick, the doubt I'd been feeling faded more and more, and I felt strong following Petey's bobbing head, the splashes from his feet and arms. If the soldiers' bloated bodies and skeletons existed, if Donnie Chensky and the teenagers in the wreck were down below, all wanting company, they would have to wait, because I swam faster than I did at the beach races, even faster than the ones at the rec center. I was the great white shark I'd watched earlier, torpedoing through the ocean. Only I wasn't hunting seals or spooking a cameraman in a shark cage. I was hunting my destiny, and a strike would change my life forever. I would be a man. As we reached the halfway point, Petey's head and limbs disappeared. I slowed my breaststroke to a crawl and scanned the water, the current carrying me along. Nothing. He was gone. I turned and tried to yell at Chet and Miles, who were both watching from atop the bank. Water sloshed into my nose and mouth. I gagged and spun around. The island was close. Even though my arms and legs were weakening, I knew I could make it. I thought of Petey, though, somewhere down under the surface. Thought of the time our snow fort collapsed on me, and how Petey, who'd been outside, dug me out, just as I'd begun to panic and gasp for air, terrified that I was going to suffocate. I cried out, took a deep breath, and a last look at the sun, then dove under, looking for Petey. It was dark and turbulent, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim underworld of the river. The bottom was lost in a forest of tall, stringy weeds swaying around in the current. A monster pike flashed by, its cold, dark eye fixing on me momentarily before it shot into the weeds. I swam forward and down, my lungs throbbing, eyes swelling, the roar of the Mackey's Rapids in the distance rumbling in my skull. Then I saw something, off to my left, a flash of white in the forest of green at the bottom. A limp arm. Petey's arm. I grabbed it frantically with both of my hands just as my mouth burst open, the air from my lungs expelling in a torrent of bubbles. I fought towards the surface, hauling Petey, my best buddy, to a sunlight that had never looked so distant and strange. When I breached the surface, I rolled onto my back and struggled to lift Petey's slippery body up so his head was out of the river. Weeds had entangled around his neck as if they'd been attempting to choke him and bind him to the bottom. We'd been swept down to where the river opened up wider,